Hi guys, Steve here. Today we're going to be talking about when to use armor-piercing rounds, when to use high-explosive rounds in World of Warships Legends. But before we can really answer the question when should you be using them, we first need to understand both the characteristics of each particular shell, and also we need to understand what's occurring when these shells are striking our targets. So first off, we'll talk about armor-piercing rounds. What they're intended to do is they're intended to punch through thick armor and explode internally. So how that works is when the shell hits armor that's sufficient enough to trigger the delayed fuse, the fuse is triggered. It continues to travel a little bit, like a fraction of a second more internally through some armor, and then it's designed to blow up internally, causing maximum damage. Um, It does not activate the fuse if it strikes really thin armor or if it misses or bounces or anything like that. It only blows up properly if the fuse is activated by striking sufficiently thick armor, traveling through the armor, and then blowing up internally. High explosive rounds are designed to explode on contact, and they're intended to start like surface fires on the area. So armor piercing rounds, when they work as intended, they're going to cause more damage than high explosive rounds are. Although high explosive rounds, if they're setting fires, do have a lingering, um, you know, delayed effect damage, I guess you could say. But, you know, the situation is we'd rather use armor piercing rounds when they work, but a lot of times they don't work. So now if you look at the four outcomes below the two shells, you have these little icons that pop up every time a shell strikes your target. That little sing noise or whatever goes off, and you probably think, wow, I keep hitting this thing, I must be messing it up. And then you look at your damage up in the right hand corner and it says you're not doing much. So what's going on here? So we need to understand what these icons are. So the left icon is the one you want to see ideally. That's the shell going through the armor and then exploding as intended on the inside. So the left icon means your shell penetrated and did the maximum amount of damage that it could. The next one looks like a picture of the shell kind of being shattered as it strikes the armor. That's when your shell hits the armor but does not penetrate. So the armor is either too thick. Well, that's basically what it is. The armor is too thick for the caliber of your shell, or the velocity of your shell is not high enough or whatever, but it's just not going through the armor, so it's basically an ineffective shot. The third icon is called overpenetration. Now this one is an important concept to understand. It's not as readily apparent as the second and the fourth ones are. So this is the situation where your armor-piercing shell is actually entering the target and then passing through the target without the detonator being triggered. So we're hitting thin armor that's not sufficiently thick to set off the explosion internally. So the shell's striking the target, it's doing about 10% damage than a properly exploding AP shell would do. But because it's either coming in too fast, too high a velocity, whatever, or it's hitting really thin armor, it's passing through the target. It's not doing as much damage as you'd like it to do. All right, and the fourth icon is the shell striking the target at an angle where it bounces. So I'm going to talk about angling in a different video. It's another fairly complex subject that deserves its own kind of overview, but if you're from World of Tanks, which a lot of players are, you should kind of have a rough idea about angling your armor. So those are the core concepts you need to know to kind of understand when you want to be using the shells. Alright, so now that we have those core concepts kind of down, we need to start thinking about how to actually apply them. So the next step is to kind of basically say, like, you want to use armor piercing rounds when you can. Well, when can you use them? Typically, the first thing you're going to start looking for is like a ship that is presenting its full broadside to you, because the armor on the side of the ship, when it's flat towards you, facing towards you, that's when it's going to be kind of the thinnest. Now the armor at the front and the back of the ship on the sides is going to be thinner than the armor in the middle of the sides. All right, and again, we'll take a look at ship's armor in another video, but just to start thinking about it. So if we can strike the ship, we can get the shell to go into it in such a way so it explodes before it goes through, then we want to use the armor piercing round. Pretty much, if we can't get that to happen, then we want to switch over to high explosive. All right. So, just kind of keep your eye. Here's what I mean. In your mind, high explosive should kind of be the default, and then armor piercing should be the opportunity that you're looking for. Factors to consider are distance. The further away, the longer or the higher your shell is going to be arced into the air to get there. So it's going to come down at a steeper angle, less likely to penetrate. You're not going to be hitting the side where the critical stuff is that you're shooting for with an armor piercing round. So you're going to want to use high explosive rounds at range. A good baseline in my mind is like 8 kilometers away or higher for at least cruisers. But cruisers are going to be switching back and forth the most. Spoiler alert towards 3 minutes into the future. But so distance, the longer away, you're more inclined to use high explosive. If the target's close and your shot's basically going to be going straight at it, it's not going to be arced in, then armor piercing rounds have a better chance of going through the target. Another factor again is the armor angle of the target. Is it flat broadside to you, or is it kind of pointed towards you or away from you? And consider the caliber of the gun versus the thickness of the armor. So we'll go over the different classes of ships and like the starting point for the ways to think about your armors or your ammo selection with those. But again, it's the starting point. The main thing you want to be able to do is read the icons when you're striking them, be able to interpret what's happening with your shells, and then react accordingly. Alright, so playing as a battleship, if you were to just set it on armor-piercing rounds and leave it alone for the entire match, that would work pretty damn well for you. But if you want to optimize it, the vast majority of your shells, probably 90%, would want to be armor-piercing rounds. When do you want to use high explosive rounds? When you're playing battleships. You want to be using it against battleships that are well angled so that your shells are going to be like bouncing, or they're not penetrating. And in that case, okay, well, rather than doing minimal or no damage, you might as well hit them with high explosives, which they're still powerful shells with battleships, and you get the chance to set the fires, which causes residual damage. And HE you can use against destroyers. Destroyers, the armor's so thin that your trigger on your AP shells are never going to go off, and they're just going to pass through, again causing 10% damage. So those are the two kind of main situations that I would recommend using HE in. But the consideration that you got to keep in mind as a battleship is how long does it take me to change the shell? If it's, let's say you're almost through your reload and then you decide, oh, maybe I want to switch to HE or vice versa. Do you really want to go another 20, 30 seconds, whatever it is, for your reload before you can shoot? Or would you rather just shoot armor piercing and maybe penetrate or maybe not penetrate, So again, I'm basically leaving on armor piercing unless I see a situation where I know I'm gonna probably have the same situation that I'm looking at right now is probably still gonna exist by the time I can reload into HE, So if this battleship is facing near forward towards, almost forward towards me, in other words, he's angling his armor properly against me, does it look like he's still going to be doing that in the future to make it worth my while to switch? Those are the calculations in your mind. Or am I going to be engaged with this destroyer long enough where it's going to be worth my time to switch to you know, HE, or if I just hit him with AP, that'll still do some damage. Do I have someone else supporting me that's going to be shooting at him too? If so, I'm just going to leave it on armor piercing.
The enemy team has taken the lead.
For playing cruisers, you're going to find yourself switching the ammo back and forth more often than the other classes. Just because the guns are kind of in the sweet spot. They're not overly powerful and they're not weak like destroyer guns. So for cruisers, let's start off with kind of the rules of thumb. Against battleships, you're going to want to be using high explosives a lot of times, unless you're close enough where the shells are flying at a low enough trajectory, and then they're obviously you want to be shooting them when they're broadside. So if the ship's within 8 kilometers and it's presenting a broadside to you, switch over to AP, take a couple volleys, see if it goes through. If it doesn't, no big deal. Switch back to high explosive rounds. Against destroyers, you're gonna want to use high explosives again, just because your guns are probably going to be going through them. Same problem that battleships have against destroyers, just so weakly armored that the triggers on your AP shells aren't going to be going off properly. So it's best to use HE. You can hit them a few times, you might get a fire, and it shouldn't take too many shots to take them out. So HE against battleships, unless the situation warrants, and HE against destroyers. Cruisers, in general, you're probably going to want to just use armor-piercing rounds, unless they're, again, very well angled. Cruisers aren't as armored, obviously, as battleships, but they can angle. But in general, I'd start off with AP rounds. Again, watch how the shells are reacting by looking at the icons and adjust accordingly. And finally, destroyers. Now, as a class, obviously the destroyers tend to be more focused on torpedoes than the guns. A lot of destroyers won't fire hardly any shells unless they need to, but it varies with ship to ship, of course. Now, destroyers basically put it on HE and you're good to go. It's kind of like the opposite of battleships. When do you want to use AP? Against destroyers at long range is really the only situation I can think of. And it's kind of the opposite. So you're dealing with a lightly armored ship, but at long range, your small caliber gun will actually potentially get stuck in it, or if it's still close enough, even though it's a light caliber gun, if it's close enough, even a destroyer can go right through another destroyer. So it's kind of this weird paradoxical situation where most guns are thinking about using AP at shorter ranges because it has a harder time penetrating at distance, but with destroyers it's kind of flipped. So AP against destroyers at long range, again, probably think about over 8 kilometers. Under that, HE against everything else. Your gun caliber is really light, so it's not going to be penetrating much. So that's a quick rundown of the shell types and when to use them. Again, those are the basic tools. I just need you to build upon it by using experience and reading the situation, seeing what happens when you shoot the shots, and reacting accordingly. So if you liked the video, please hit the thumbs up. If you're new to the channel, consider subscribing to stay up with more World of Tanks and World of Warships content. If you have any comments on ammo types or any questions whatsoever, leave them below in the comments, and we'll see you guys all later. Alright, peace.